The story starts in the afternoon in some mansion where some girl with black hair named Erzeta doesn't understand why she needs to get married. In addition, the father of the girl did not like her behavior, saying that she behaves just like a little child. Also, he did not understand why she is so unhappy because in any case, this marriage has long been planned already. Also, the man doesn't understand where his daughter is going to find a better mate, so she should just trust him. On hearing this, Erzeta was much angered and did not understand how such an important matter could be settled by a mere letter, which did not please the father of the family, and he stood up abruptly and began to shout at his daughter, asking her why she was so opposed to the marriage, as he was trying hard for her own good. After a while, the girl was in her room talking to some girl with red hair. She was displeased that of all people, she should marry Ruggieri Levanto. In fact, this girl is the main character of this story, called Farm. She was also a little puzzled and didn't understand why Erzeta was back at it again. That Erzeta didn't like Erzeta very much because she thinks there's no way she can marry this man. Plus, when she asked her father to change his mind, he wouldn't even listen to his own daughter and asked her to at least give Ruggieri a chance to prove himself at the meeting. Erzeta also believes that this marriage is only to bring their families closer together, not for her happiness, so she can't just marry him. At least this marriage that can establish a bond between their families can bring harmony to their world. This harmony will not last, for not everything in this world is subject to their marriage contract. So Erzeta believes that in such situations, one must rely on one's own strength, and that is why she has studied magic for so long. Crying, the girl looked at Farm, who was trying her best to cheer up Erzet, but she couldn't do it at all. Erzeta was considered the pride of Sola. She stood out for her beautiful looks and high intelligence, but she hated the Marquis of Levanto with all her soul. Erzeta has been conducting secret research for a long time, trying to explain events that happened before the current church age, and so the heroine was able to confirm the existence of magic and fairies. Erzeta published her work under the pseudonym Vincenzo Costasenio, but the public did not appreciate her writings. One of the main critics of her writings was Ruggiero Levanto. He criticized her work, telling everyone something nonsense from the ranks of fiction, not worthy of any attention. Farm, looking at her crying, Erzeta did not understand how the existence of magi can be believed by scientists, if even ordinary people deny it. Besides, Erzeta was more upset by the fact of non-acceptance of her work than the criticism itself. Besides, all people think magic only exists in fairy tales, so it can't help but upset Erzet. The maid approached Erzeta and tried to calm her down, but suddenly Erzeta turned around, asking Farma to help her in any way possible. Touching Farm's arm, Erzeta asked her to go on a blind date instead, since nothing could happen if she just went there after all. Hearing this, Farm was a little surprised, for Erzeta wants her to go instead of the bride. The hour of the wedding must determine the fate of the whole country. Smiling, she asked Mistress to calm down as she was now emotional and talking nonsense. Erzeta, however, calmed down and explained to Farma that she meant what she said. When the maid heard this, she could not understand why Erzeta said such unthinkable things, and she even began to think that Erzeta just needed a reason for dismissing her. Erzeta didn't like it, and she immediately explained to Farma that it's not really true, and she is her best friend. But the main character couldn't understand how she should do it because they don't look alike at all. Even their hair color is different. Shouting Farme explained that she is just an ordinary Farmy and is no match for Sola's beauty, so she thinks they will be exposed right away. After hearing that, Erzeta asked Farma not to say such nonsense, since she really does look amazing. She also added that rumors are always exaggerated by people as well, so no one will even realize anything. Suddenly, Erzeta got the idea that she intends to put makeup on the main character, and that way even her father won't be able to tell them apart. The girl also added that even if something goes wrong, she promises that she will take responsibility, so Farma shouldn't worry about anything. Erzeta also explained to Farma that she would never have put her in such an uncomfortable position, however she simply had no choice left to her. The lady advised the protagonist to just not think about it, and to calmly go on a quick date and quickly get back out again. After hearing that Erzeta would take responsibility if she was caught, the protagonist got a little excited and realized that she had nothing to lose. However, if the Duke finds out about it, she will definitely be fired, and she will be out of a job. But Farm realizes that they cannot refuse Erzeta in any way. After all, they've been together for 5 years, and if the protagonist refuses the mistress, she'll have a guilty conscience. Suddenly screaming, the protagonist announced that she would go on a date instead, which surprised Erzet a little. That same night in the castle of Levanto Fiammolo, a man tells the Duke that Ruggieri won't come out of his room. Then the Duke decided to deal with his son himself, and began to tell him that they would not discuss the marriage further, as he could inherit the title of Duke. Ruggieri, meanwhile, was outside the door and began pounding his fist loudly on the door, shouting that he would never leave this room until they gave up on the idea. Fiammolo didn't understand why it was so hard for Ruggieri to marry and take over the castle, which made him even more angry, and he said that if his father said one more word, he would do something terrible to himself right away. When Fiammolo heard this, he did not understand how a son could speak to his father like that. So he ordered a knight to go and fetch a club, as he wanted to show Ruggieri his place. After a while, the guy was still in his room thinking that he couldn't even think that they would just break down the door. Suddenly from this hole appeared the hand of a servant with a letter. This man stated something, a message from the Duke of, reading this letter, Ruggieri realized that in 2 weeks there would be a friendly event with the Sola family. Also, his introduction to the lady would take place on the same day, so the Duke advised his son to prepare for this day. Clenching his fist tightly, Ruggieri didn't understand why his father wanted this wedding so badly, and then the boy realized that in this case, he could only take matters into his own hands. Suddenly, the guy yelled loudly, calling out for Angelo. After a while, Angelo was already outside the door wondering why his lordship had summoned him. At which Ruggieri, sitting quietly on the bed, asked the boy to come into the room, which surprised Angelo a little, as he didn't understand how he should do it if the doors were closed. Finally entering this room, Ruggieri immediately explained to his subordinate that he had an important assignment for him to perform. Also, taking a closer look, Ruggieri didn't understand why Angelo looked so poor, so he began to doubt that his plan would work. However, since he had no choice, he had already explained the plan, saying that in 2 weeks Angelo would be going to the Soli family for a friendly event. Ruggieri also added that he will then put Angelo on the list for the event and he will have to meet Lady Sol on his behalf. He also asked the boy not to worry as there is a good reward for it. When Angelo heard that, he was completely bewildered and didn't know how to react. Ruggieri also added that this conversation should be kept between the two of them, and if his father found out about it, they would both be in trouble. Also, the guy promised Angelo to give him whatever he wants after the completion of this assignment. Suddenly, Angelo asked Ruggieri in a calm voice if he had the right to refuse this. Upon hearing this, Ruggieri smirked and explained to Angelo that he had that right. But he reminded him that the Duke's eldest son was very vindictive, so Angelo had no choice but to agree to it. Suddenly, Angelo turned around and asked the Duke's son to give him glasses for his eyesight, because he was afraid that he could get him into trouble. But Ruggieri immediately realized that Angelo just wanted to take a chance. 2 weeks had already passed. The main character was already expecting Ruggieri, who really should be Angelo. Farm also changed her image a bit and was more like Erzet. Also, the girl does not understand why the eldest son of the Duke is late, so she thinks it would be better if he did not come at all. Suddenly, when she was about to pick up the spoon, she accidentally dropped it on the ground, which made her a little angry, and she immediately realized that this was not a good thing. Meanwhile, Angelo was already in front of the mansion thinking how modest and handsome he was. At the same time, the protagonist was under the table trying to find a fallen spoon. Suddenly looking forward, she finally saw the Duke's son, who was worried and didn't understand what the girl was doing. Rising from under the table, the protagonist felt very uncomfortable as she had embarrassed herself at the first meeting, and she would be very embarrassed in front of Erzeta. Suddenly, the guy apologized to the girl and asked her if she would let him keep her company, which surprised the girl a bit, and she couldn't even believe that this man was Ruggieri. Sometime later, when Farm had finished her date, she was walking back to Erzet's room. Erzeta was very glad to see her maid, and immediately began to ask her how her acquaintance had gone, to which Farm replied in a calm voice that it was the worst date of her life. A few hours earlier, the hero was found at the same table where they didn't talk about anything at all. The main character felt very uncomfortable because of this awkward atmosphere, so all she wanted was for this guy to say something, and she was also very curious about what he was thinking right now. Also looking at the marquee, The girl doubted his title because although he is known for his intelligence, she noticed that now he looks very unkempt. He has unkempt hair, glasses, and terrible clothes. So there's no way he looks like an aristocrat. Looking at Angelo, Farm didn't understand how he could even have the nerve to come on a date like that. So the protagonist took it back, and now she thinks she doesn't like him at all. Angelo finally spoke, and the only thing he said was that the tea they were drinking was delicious. Which is a lot on the main character because it's actually a very bitter tea, and it's been brewing for 30 minutes. Suddenly the lad stood up abruptly, and taking off his headdress declared that it was an honor to meet Erzetta, but now he must go, which surprised Pharma a little, and she didn't understand how he could call it an acquaintance, and how he could even behave like that with Mrs. Erzetta at all. According to generally accepted etiquette programs, as a sign of respect to a noble woman, a man should ask for her hand and kiss the back of her palm. So the protagonist thinks it's lucky that she's the one sitting here, because if it were Erzetta instead, she would never forgive such rudeness. Changing clothes. The main character said that despite the man's status, he behaved disrespectfully, which surprised Erzette a little, as it was not how she had imagined Ruggieri to be. Also, Farm added that his appearance left desirable too, and she could not at all understand how he dared to come to a meeting in that. And if it had not been for his clothes, she would never have thought him a marquis. Also, the main character immediately starts calming Erzette down, saying that Ruggieri doesn't seem interested in getting married either. When Erzetta heard this, she was very happy, and asked the main character to go rest, as she had done a good job today, and if she needed anything, she would call someone else. Then the protagonist joyfully ran straight to her house holding a basket of groceries. Once inside, she immediately saw her younger brother, whose name was Ronyo, sitting quietly on the couch reading a book. At that moment, the protagonist began to wonder what he had already been doing all day, and the guy gestured with his tongue that he was just reading a book. Ronyo is the only brother to Farm, but the only thing they have in common is eye color. That's all because a couple years ago the main character wasn't a maid and was struggling to survive on little money in every way possible. One day she wanted to sort out her receipts, but the boss gave her very little money. So she asked for some more, explaining that she had a younger brother who hadn't eaten at all, which the man didn't like, because he didn't understand why Pharma was still messing around with Ronyo if he wasn't her real brother. They did have different mothers. Then they were too young to survive day in and day out in the pipes, until one day there was one very important incident. Specifically, while walking through a crowded marketplace, Farm overhears two girls talking about how the lady is collecting stories about past times, and they also say that whoever tells the lady a story about fairies or wizards will be rewarded with a bag of gold coins. At that moment, the protagonist realized that if she showed her magic to Erzeth, she would receive a not insignificant reward that would help her greatly. However, Farm immediately stopped thinking about it, as she realized that she couldn't show her magic to anyone, because if she was caught, she would be considered a witch and would hardly be left alive. When the heroine got back to her house, she asked Ronyo to wait a bit. She's going to buy him something to eat tonight, and he just needs to wait until dinner. But that the guy gestured back that it was okay, and he'd look forward to seeing her. Back in town, Farm realized that she couldn't go on like this, so she decided that she would try to go there after all, hoping that Erzetta wouldn't think she was a witch. She was already imagining how the lady would like her magic, and she would at last get the money she wanted, with which she could buy plenty of food and warm clothing, in which case she might even be able to spend this winter warm. Going inside the mansion, the protagonist was immediately met by Erzetta, who was a little surprised that a child came to her, as usually older people came to her. Also, the lady asked the protagonist what she wanted to tell her, to which Farm confidently stated that she could use magic. Hearing this, Erzetta started laughing, thinking it was some kind of joke. She also advised Pharma not to joke with her like that, as she wouldn't be able to get the money. So she advised the girl to stop right now, because she's not the first person to try to trick her like this, and she's sick of hearing all these lies. Worried, Farm immediately stated that she would never dare to trick her. She also asked the lady for a chance to at least show off her abilities. Erzetta agreed, and began to watch the protagonist use her magic now. Concentrating, Farm began to accumulate all of her power into a fist from which rays of light seeped out. Suddenly, she finally let go of all that energy, which created a strong wind inside this room that threw Erzeth back a bit. When Erzetta saw the power that Farm had, she was in complete shock and couldn't believe what she was seeing. She also realized how this was possible since all the windows here were closed, to which the protagonist replied that she had only made the pieces of light floating in the air that only she could see move. Hearing this, the lady wanted to know what other abilities Farm had, so she asked to see what she could do. Upon hearing this, the protagonist immediately began to use all of her powers, including water magic, air magic, and a bunch of other different magics. At that moment, Erzeth was finally convinced that these bits of light were generating magic, and she knew it for a fact since she'd read about it in the book. Just as Erzeth awaited, Farm does not see bits of light, but what constitutes the very nature of the manipulation of them is called fairy magic. This also confirms the hypothesis that Erzeta had based her research on, and the girl was very glad that at last her efforts and labor had brought some result. So she realized that in no case she must not miss this child. However, looking at Farm, Erzeta couldn't see how she could possibly be kept here, and didn't even know what to suggest to her. It's been 5 years since the main character started working here, and now she's doing Erzet's hair. I wish the lady would hide her true beauty. Because the protagonist thinks the whole world should know that rumors of the lady's beauty are not exaggerated at all. Finally dressed, Erzeta suggested in Pharma to go home and rest, so she did a good job today. Also, she should avoid a confrontation with Marquise Levanto at all costs. After some time, the protagonist finally turned back to her home, where she just jumped on the bed as she was very tired. Suddenly, she heard someone calling for her. Going outside, the girl saw her friend Leah, who was jumping with happiness, informed Pharma that today they were having a feast. Namely, his lighter said that he would give them the leftover food and drinks from the banquet. So Leah wants Farm to be at the party too, which surprised the protagonist a little, since she was just relaxing at home today. Ronyo suddenly appeared beside her, holding a beautiful dress and advising his sister to quickly change and go. When Leah saw the dress, she was shocked as she immediately realized it was from Lady Erzet, which she agreed with, adding that it was a birthday present to her. The friend was also unhappy that the protagonist did not want to come to the party even in that outfit. But at that moment, Farm still agreed to come to the party and asked her friend to wait for a while. The protagonist can play the lute and still agree to a party to play something. After a while, she was already in front of the gate that led to the mansion's grounds, but she realized that the garden was off limits to servants, and it would take too long to go around it. But because there was no one around, the girl decided to take a quick run and get to the garden. Suddenly, when she wanted to raise her head up, she immediately hit her face into some man with glasses, to whom she immediately apologized. The man immediately turned around and hugged the girl and asked if she was all right and if she had hurt herself somewhere. To which Farm replied that she was fine, but she didn't understand who the man was, so she decided to ask who he was, to which the guy apologized for presenting himself so late, and said his name was Ruggieri Levanto, whom she'd seen yesterday. Looking the girl straight in the eyes, the guy said that he would very much like to repeat their meeting, which left the main character just puzzled, and she does not even know how to react to it. Taking her head, she did not understand what it meant, and she even began to think that Ruggieri had guessed the... Suddenly the guy said that it was very rude of him to block the lady's way in the middle of the night, for which he immediately apologized. Also, he does not understand why the heroine left the ceremony so early that he did not even have a chance to see her. Looking the girl straight in the eyes, Ruggieri said that the first thing he wanted to do was apologize for leaving so quickly last time, and he added that his behavior then left a lot to be desired, which surprised the protagonist a little, and she didn't understand what Ruggieri and why he decided to tell her about it now. Also, Ruggieri started to sincerely say that he can't explain his feelings in any way, but he doesn't have a sincere sympathy for Pharma. So he thinks his will has nothing to do with their family's relationship. Suddenly pulling his hand out, he asked the main character to give him her hand to kiss, which Farm did. Then, the guy just walked away, leaving the main character completely bewildered and not understanding what just happened at all. Being at the party, the girl did not understand how Ruggieri dared to tell her about his feelings. Also, she could not even imagine that the son of the Duke could feel sympathy for her. Also, Farm could never forget the boy's words, and she always caught herself thinking of him, which displeased her greatly. Meanwhile, Angelo was looking at the night sky, thinking how cool the air was today. He also realized that his meeting with the protagonist was a bit delayed, but tomorrow he could finally go back. But it wouldn't have happened if that Viscount hadn't intervened. It happened a couple days ago when the guy was talking to Ruggieri. Suddenly, someone started coming into their room, so Angelo had to hide somewhere as soon as possible, and he decided to hide under the bed. At the same time, Ruggieri shouted at him, saying that if he did not hide now, they would be caught, and they would not be able to get away with just a wedding, and in that case, they could even be sent to war. Suddenly, Viscount Moretti, who is the Duke of Levanto's secretary, entered the room. Ruggieri didn't like Moretti at all. Besides, he wouldn't have come here for nothing, since he is his father's loyal dog. The Duke's eldest son decided that he should by no means relax right now. Having finally sat down at the table, Moretti asked little Ruggieri how his acquaintance with Lady Sola had gone, to which the boy, trying to calm down, replied that everything was fine, and all the rumors were true. Suddenly, the Viscount noticed that Ruggieri was already dressed in different clothes, so he thought that for this brief encounter he had poured tea on himself. The man also added that he saw him in the hallway in the same clothes, but now Ruggieri is in a different outfit. Suddenly, the man started laughing, saying that Ruggieri didn't think he was above a clown, but that it hurt him a lot, which surprised Ruggieri a little because he didn't know what he was talking about. Upon hearing this, the Viscount immediately began to smirk, and said that in fact everyone around him was not so stupid as Ruggieri thought. The man also added that although he did not know that the Duke's eldest son was still a snotty child, he still could not understand his train of thought. Banging his fist loudly on the table, Moretti didn't understand how he could send a servant in his place for such an important meeting. He also added that Ruggieri had been watched by Moretti's man the whole time. When he heard this, Ruggieri was completely bewildered and did not understand why Moretti did not stop him then, if he knew everything about his plans. At which the man, grinning, ordered the lad to promise that he would marry Erzet, and if he refused, Moretti would tell the Duke everything. The boy did not understand how some servant dared to threaten him, to which Moretti, bowing and laughing, replied that no matter how Ruggieri tried to frighten him, he would still be a laughing stock. The Viscount also added that the Duke's son was only required to consent to the marriage, because in any case, he could divorce at any time. Hearing this, the boy still could not understand why they needed all this so much, and what use at all of this marriage. Ruggieri also did not understand why the Duke's secretary was following him as if he had no other duties, to which the man turned around and replied that he had come here on purpose to meet Duke Sola secretly. Finally, with the Vicomte gone, Angelo was finally able to get out from under the bed in peace. Looking the Duke's son straight in the eye, the lad declared that now that he had completed the errand, he wanted to be rewarded. Ruggieri, who was already in a lot of trouble, thought Angelo would probably ask for a lot of gold coins. But as it turned out, Angelo had actually asked Ruggieri to make him a free man, which surprised the Duke's son a little. Angelo explained his desire by saying that since he belongs to the Levanto family, he is forbidden to leave the territory or find another job without authorization. And that's why Angelo wants to finally get his freedom. But Ruggieri was a little puzzled because all this time he thought Angelo was just a hired servant, and he didn't even know he could belong to their family. At that moment, Ruggieri answered that it was not so easy to do so, as he was not the most important person here, and he could not make such decisions on his own, which made Angelo a bit sad, and he asked if it would ever change. To which the guy replied that he promised to give Angelo whatever he wanted, but he couldn't. Hearing this, Angelo was just furious, and grabbing Ruggieri by his clothes, he started shouting at him, saying that he promised to give him anything. Ruggieri was greatly surprised at his servant's behavior, and was reminded that he was now speaking to the Duke's son. Suddenly, Ruggieri realized that although Moretti said that after the marriage Ruggieri could get a divorce, it was impossible because his father would never give his consent. So the Marquis realized that if he wanted to get a divorce, he had to get it from the Sol family. If Lady decides to get a divorce or not marry at all, Ruggieri will finally be able to avoid the marriage he so badly wants. When he calmed down, he shouted at his servant and explained to him that this behavior would get him executed. But the Marquis decided that now he wouldn't have to do his duty or worry that his father would find out about their deception. He also explained that they are such a violent person, so he offered Angelo another deal. Approaching him, he asked the guy to seduce Princess Sol. Namely, Angelo needs to convince her to give up the engagement and he can even spread rumors about her, well, the main thing that he did so that this marriage did not take place. Besides, Angelo doesn't know Ruggieri at all, so he shouldn't have a problem with it. If everything fails, he won't get anything for it. And if everything works out, Ruggieri promised that he will definitely free Angelo. Back to the present, where Angelo stares out the window. Doesn't know how a man as smart as Ruggieri can think such thoughts. He also imagined the protagonist thinking it was Erzeta. Then when they met for the second time, he noticed that she was without a veil. And without it, she looked even better than he thought she did. Though he doesn't know where it might lead, he is now obligated to make her fall in love with him, so she can finally escape the Levanto family and stop being a slave. The next day, Erzet's mother Milena was very happy for her daughter because she had recently received a positive letter from the Levanto family about her last meeting, so the woman once again advised her daughter to marry Ruggieri. The woman also added that Erzet's father is planning a civil engineering project to connect the Itika lakes to the ocean, and if it works out, their family will be able to trade with the southern continent. They want to secure investment from the allied nations for the project, but the canal will pass through a river located in the Duchy of Levanto. At that moment, the princess finally realized what the marriage was for, which was just to keep the relationship between the countries close. Milena also added that the main problem now has to do with Erzet's younger sister, whose name is Visa. Her fate is already decided, and she should meet a good partner with whom she will live happily together like many other women. However, since Erzeta is the eldest daughter, her father believes that her marriage should be the first one. So Milena advised her daughter to be patient until the end of the project, and after that she will definitely get her divorce, which made Erzet a little happy, although it is not visible on her face. At the end of spring, Lady Sol and the Marquis of Levanto officially exchanged their engagement papers, so the princess received a small gift of a ring from Ruggieri. Erzeta took this ring and asked Farm not to worry, as she is sure that her parents are only interested in political gain, so she is sure that she will never even see her husband. Besides, if his feelings were sincere, Ruggieri would not betroth her in writing, which means that he doesn't care about her. As she watched the princess leave, the protagonist realized that she hadn't even told her about that day yet, in which she met the Marquis by chance in the garden, and he confessed his feelings to her. However, she realized that Lady wouldn't be seeing him until after the divorce, which pleased her greatly, and meant she might not even tell her anything. Also, Farm realized that Ruggieri most likely also did not immediately know about this project, so he rushed to rectify the situation. Therefore, in this case, the protagonist decided that and no longer need to see him, and Erzeta will not have to endure this marriage for a long time. Suddenly, the lady said to her maid that it wasn't time to pack, because Mass was about to begin. After some time in the church, the priest looking at Erzet called her a very wise and kind lady. Then the girl thanked the priest for his prayers, and decided to ask him if he was not busy and could give her some time. But the man had to refuse because he already had a meeting scheduled for today. The priest was also Erzet's teacher, and she wondered who her teacher was meeting. To which the man replied that this was his first meeting, as they had only communicated in letters before, and his interlocutor was a scholar with extensive knowledge. When the girl heard that, she was greatly astonished, for she had never seen her teacher recognize any other person. After some time back in her room, the girl was wondering how interesting that scientist was, since even teacher Betos had praised him, so she waited for him to talk to her. Meanwhile, the protagonist looked at the lady and noticed that her expression was very different from her usual expression, which meant that the teacher's words had inspired her greatly. Suddenly, Erzeta noticed him at the gate, so she asked Farm to bring him here quickly. Down, the protagonist was glad for Erzet's good cheer. Suddenly looking ahead, she saw some man talking to the guards at the gate, so she assumed something might be him. However, when she looked closely, she noticed that the man's face was quite familiar, and she immediately realized that she had definitely seen him before. She finally realized it was Ruggieri Levanto. This shocked the girl so much that she even started to run at full speed. I don't know why he is there, so she immediately ran to Erzet's room to quickly tell her about it. Upon entering the room, the protagonist immediately started shouting, saying that the man who pretends to be a church scientist is actually Ruggieri Levanto, and that Farm thinks they should kick him out of here right now. Erzeta was a little surprised at what she heard, and decided to look out the window to see if Ruggieri had really come here. But she didn't see anyone there. Suddenly, the girls heard Ruggieri, who was outside the door, ask the girls if he could come in, which scared them a lot. At that moment, the protagonist realized that if Marquis saw the real princess now, they'd be exposed, so they had to figure something out. However, before she could even say anything, Ruggieri entered the room and immediately saw Farm. He immediately apologized for walking in so abruptly, explaining that the door was already open. Meanwhile, Erzetta had managed to hide quickly and was doing her best not to make a single sound, while the maid listened to Ruggieri, who was apologizing for his rudeness, saying that he had simply not heard Erzetta's reply. Taking a deep breath, the protagonist replied that, although she didn't answer anything, Erzet had no right to enter her room. He bowed to the girl and said that it was an honor to meet her again, because he is a big fan of old books, and his name is Elio. When she heard this, Farm was a bit surprised and didn't understand why Ruggieri was presenting himself under a different name, so she immediately asked him not to lie since she knew him under a different name, which surprised the lad a little, and he smiled, glad that the princess had remembered him for such a time as this. Pointing the finger at the guy, Farm explained to him that entering the mansion under a false name is a serious offense, at which the Marquis smirkingly asked the girl if wanting to see his wife was a crime, which surprised the real Erzet, and she didn't realize what it was. Suddenly, Ruggieri noticed that the ring on Farm's finger was missing, and he wondered where it might have gone missing. The girl explained then that she thought he wouldn't be interested in it. Also, she took it off because she was afraid of losing such a valuable gift. Suddenly, she started yelling at the Marquis, telling him that in any case, he had invaded her room under a false name, and she doubted he had anything to do with her teacher either. But Ruggieri was very calm, and even though the girl wasn't particularly happy to see him here, even just being able to hear, and her voice made the guy happy. At that moment, Farm decided to look at the boy's finger and noticed a ring on his fingers, the same as Mrs. Erzet's, and then she realized that it was indeed a wedding ring. The protagonist started to explain to him that she couldn't make up her mind about a person in one meeting, but that the guy reminded her that they'd seen each other twice. Farm also asked him not to worry as she is not going to break off the engagement as they share a common goal, which surprised the guy a little bit, and he asked the girl if she'd dump him later. This surprised the girl a bit, and she didn't understand how he could know that. So she turned around and said she had nothing more to say and asked him to leave since she was actually waiting for the scientist. After hearing this, Ruggieri realized that he had to call it a day, although he still wanted to stay in this beautiful country a little longer. He also asked for the girl's hand, which she doesn't like, but since he thinks she's a princess, she has to follow all the rules of etiquette, so she gave him her hand. At the moment when Ruggieri kissed Farma's hand, she felt herself blushing, though it was a common greeting, but the Marquise's eyes remained in her memory. Remembering his eyes, the protagonist sees this man as a confident man who knows exactly what he wants. Finally, when Ruggieri left, Erzetta was finally able to get out to talk to her maid, as she had a bunch of different questions for her. Namely, Erzet was wondering why Marquis said he had seen her twice, though they had only met once. At that moment, the protagonist was forced to explain everything to the lady, and she confessed everything. She explained that on the day of the Visa's coming-of-age ceremony, she accidentally ran into the Marquis in the garden. Then he confessed his feelings, but he did not reveal their plan. Hearing this, Erzetta suggested that Ruggieri had probably fallen in love with Farma, which surprised the protagonist a bit, and she asked the lady not to pour salt on the wound, as she already felt uncomfortable talking to the Marquis. The princess explained that there could be no other since he was acting very gentle and affectionate with Farm. She was also very curious as to what the guy looked like, to which the protagonist responded that there was nothing special about him, that he wasn't a regular guy. Realizing the situation Farm was in, Erzetta told her not to worry and promised to protect her, as a connection with the heir would cause her a lot of trouble. The girl also added that Farm was already like a sister to her, so there was no way she was going to let some Ruggieri take her away from her. At night, the main character was in her bed, where she could not sleep because she heard in her head the words that she should never fall in love. Because if the mind overrides feelings, then her magic can disappear. When she opened her eyes, she somehow felt that this voice was very familiar, and she immediately remembered the words she had heard in her dream. The main character still cannot forget those terrible hungry times when she did not have magic, then, and had to live with rats in the attic. Besides the fact that she had never been fed, Ronyo was too young, and she thought it was a miracle they hadn't starved to death. Even though the protagonist doesn't remember where she heard that voice, she realizes she can't lose her power, so she promised herself she would never fall in love with anyone. The next day, Farm was already talking to Erzetta, and I explained to her that tonight she had heard someone's voice in a dream, and it seemed to be imprinted on her memory, so she couldn't forget it. The girl also added that this voice didn't sound like a human voice at all, which surprised Erzetta a little, and she immediately told her friend that it was most likely the voice of a fairy. She began to explain that Western folk tales often wrote about the blessings or curses of fairies. They are described as capricious and fickle creatures, and if true, it's no wonder the protagonist can't understand the reason for her amazing gift. Then Farm wondered if she should wait until the fairies were no longer capricious, and if she could thus unravel the secrets of magic, with which Lady instantly agreed, adding that in this way the protagonist proves the existence of magic, as there is something at the root of every phenomenon. Erzetta also added that magic is not a mysterious power, and if you look at records from before the Church Age, you can see a device and way of life that cannot be recreated even with current technology. So the lady thinks this proves that magic is widely used. Listening to this, the protagonist was completely perplexed as she didn't understand what the lady was talking about, as she is not a scientist. Suddenly, Erzetta told Pharma that since she had water, fire, and air, they should start with them for now. After a while, the hero were already in the National Academy of Soleil, where they talked to Adriano Jeremy, who is the head of the Faculty of Astronomy. He returned the book to the girl saying that he liked it very much, but he doubts that stupid students will be able to understand it, which surprised the protagonist and Erzetta a bit. Then she immediately asked the head if it's true that they say that they are feuding with the religious faculty, since those considered their research blasphemy. Also, the lady noticed that there are very few people in the academy today, and she was wondering what happened. That the leaders replied that everyone is in the conference room, since they say that they got some treasure, which surprised the princess a little, and she was beginning to wonder what this treasure was. At the same time as Farm looked at the expression on the lady's face and knew immediately that now they would go there. Walking into the conference room, the heroes saw teachers throwing books at each other. Also, the teachers were arguing amongst themselves, and it almost came to a fight. Erzetta was shocked that the teachers could behave like that, and immediately started yelling at them, saying that it was enough, and she reminded them that they were in an academy, not a circus, and if her father found out about it, he'd have them all demoted immediately. When the men heard this, they were a little frightened, and immediately calmed down, apologizing to the lady. Suddenly, the girl noticed some blueprints on the floor, and immediately realized that it was a blueprint of construction equipment. So she asked the teachers if this blueprint they call their treasure. However, one of the teachers began to explain to the girl that in fact it's all the ravings of a country bumpkin who never went to college. But another teacher immediately interrupted him, saying that in fact this project is genius. The teachers began to describe this drawing. They say that he was a tall and handsome young man. Also, his hair was the color of wheat flour, and he introduced himself as Elio Rodonati. He called himself a scholar from the West. When the protagonist heard this name, she was astonished, because it was the name under which the Marquis Levanto disguised himself when he pretended to be a scientist in order to get into her mansion. After a while, the heroines had left the academy and were on their way back to the mansion. Erzetta was telling her friend that she was amazed at the Marquise's cleverness, as this equipment would be of great help in the construction of the canal, and as much as she didn't want to do it, she thought she should advise her father to invite him over. However, there was something that bothered her, and that was that she didn't understand why Ruggieri had decided to come to Sola under a different name, which puzzled Pharma a little too, and she realized that this man was actually more mysterious than she had thought. At that moment, Lady decided that they had to go back to her father immediately anyway, as there was no way they were going to miss out on such talent. The lady also realized that she could ask her father to find out Ruggieri's real intentions. After a while, the Marquis was already talking to the Duke, who was very surprised that Ruggieri didn't want any position. Marquis explained that he was simply not competent in public affairs, so he didn't see how he could be given anything for such a silly idea, which struck the Duke, as he had always thought that talented people usually seek recognition among other equally talented people. Also did not understand why Ruggieri refuses such a good offer, as he does not force the Marquis to anything. But Marquis stated that he just read himself a regular Batos priest costume and heard about the canal project by accident. Yes, and proposed the idea just out of the blue, but since it would help with construction that could enrich everyone, the guy wanted to talk more about it, which the Duke immediately realized and asked the man what he wanted, to which Ruggieri replied that he had but one small request. He began to say that he had a talent for painting, because he used to be interested in art, and when painting a picture it is important not only the technique, but also the meaning that is put into it, and the image of noble things helps in promoting the picture. In addition to this, any artist wants to leave behind something worthwhile, so the man would like to paint a portrait of the noble Lady Solette, which surprised the Duke a little, and he immediately wanted to find out if the Marquis was talking about his eldest daughter, to which the lad agreed, pounding his fist on the table and smiling. He said he would think about the proposal and give answers shortly. This is the whole story Lady told the main character. They say that after this incident she had a very hard time calming her father down. Farm didn't understand why she had to do all this, since Marquis had already left his drawing. But the lady immediately explained to her friend that it was just a sketch, and they had no right to simply take over someone else's work without his consent. The princess also added that there was another reason why they needed Ruggieri, and that reason had to do with digging the canal, which is a very hard black job. This work can definitely lead to the enslavement of commoners and serfs. It is also said that hundreds of people have died in the Elup Canal, but if the machine takes care of it, they won't have to endanger hundreds of innocent people. So all they have to do is fulfill the Marquis's request, and then they can get a detailed drawing of the model of this car. Upon hearing this, the protagonist realized that she couldn't just watch her best friend suffer, so she said that Marquis could paint her. Besides, since she is a personal maid, it is her duty to help the lady in every way possible, which surprised Erzeth a bit, and she didn't understand why would Pharma do such a stupid request, to which the protagonist replied something just her job. She also tried to reassure the princess in every way possible. They say that Marquis himself goes by another man's name, which means that everything will be fine. Also, nothing will happen to them if they are not uncovered. So the girl intends to do everything for the good of the lady, besides which the Duke himself will be very grateful for the deed, which touched Erzet, and rejoicing she hugged her best friend, saying she was very glad to have met her. It was also a shame for the lady that Pharma had to put up with this obnoxious guy all the time, since he wasn't even her type, to which the protagonist told the princess not to worry, as she would sort everything out and do everything for Erzet's sake, although she realized that Lady was right, and if Marquis wasn't handsome, then everyone else was just pale in comparison. Smiling and worried, the protagonist thought about the fact that her loyalty to the master might be questioned if she didn't agree to it. Besides, she has nothing to lose by meeting him. Finally, when the girl realized what she was thinking, she immediately tried to relax and not fill her head with unnecessary thoughts. After a while, the protagonist was already dressed as a real princess and was preparing to meet the Marquis. Erzetta looked at Farm and was struck by her beauty and thought that she looked just like a fairy, and it would be bad if Marquis fell in love with her even more, which the protagonist did not like and asked the lady not to say anything about it. The lady was also a little worried about the protagonist, as she will not be able to attend their meetings. So she suggested the girl to leave a maid with her, but Farm immediately refused to do so, explaining that then she will not be able to pretend to be a princess. Upon hearing this, Erzetta reminded the protagonist that she was more important than anything else, and said that she would be sitting in the next room. So if anything unpleasant happened to her, she could tell Erzetta about it right away. After a while, some maid informed the protagonist that she had a visitor, who was actually a Marquis, who came here under the name of Elio. Farm looked at the man and immediately reminded him that he wasn't afraid to use another man's name at all, to which the artist replied that nobody forbids to change one's name in this or that situation, which surprised the girl a little, and she replied that only those who do not have any merits say so. Upon hearing this, the artist immediately knelt down before the girl, saying he would do anything for her, which surprised Pharma a little, and she did not understand why such a handsome man would flatter her so, and do such a thing for her. She turned away and asked Elio to get up, since he couldn't draw on his knees. Besides, she didn't want to sit here all day, so the artist should start his work quickly. The second the artist began to paint a portrait of the noble lady. Suddenly, the protagonist felt her neck itch, but she realized that she could not move as it would spoil the whole picture. Suddenly, when she saw the painter turn away, she thought it was the perfect moment to scratch her neck. But Elio noticed it and started laughing, which surprised the girl a bit, and she didn't understand why she was being laughed at, so she decided to ask the artist about it. Elio apologized for being so late in explaining this to the girl, namely that you don't have to sit still at the beginning of work, which surprised Pharma a little, and she was not happy that all this time and had to sit and not move though she could relax. The painter apologized for the umpteenth time and began to reassure the lady, saying that for now she could relax and read some book or embroider. Hearing this, the protagonist was finally able to relax and lean back in her chair, as she had been wanting to do for a long time now. She also picked up the first book she could find, which turned out to be a history book, but that didn't bother her at all, and she started reading it. Through it had been some time since the girl had picked up this book, and she was already feeling rather tired. Suddenly, looking at the artist who was painstakingly drawing her, she couldn't stop thinking about how handsome he was, so she decided to ask Ruggieri if it was okay, which surprised the artist a little, and he was a little surprised that he could somehow interest the lady. To which Farm, worrying and hiding behind the book, reminded the artist that it was her portrait after all, and of course she'd be interested in. To which the artist smilingly replied that most likely his drawing skills would not be at all sufficient to convey her beauty. That little bit of protagonist, and she didn't understand at all why he had made her sit there then. Ruggieri explained that he just wanted to get to know the protagonist better, and it wasn't hard for him to make the drawing that brought them together in the first place. When Farm heard that, she was a little puzzled and did not understand why the artist was looking for an excuse to meet her. But the guy replied that it was very simple, namely, he just wanted to get to know the girl better in order to build a good, healthy relationship. Now it was Ruggieri's turn to question the girl, and he started asking her different questions like what kind of tea she drinks and what kind of food she likes to eat. That calmed the girl, for she was afraid that Ruggieri would ask questions about why she was not a real princess. Also calmed, she answered all his questions, saying that she liked ordinary tea and liked pickled duck meat, but she did not particularly like sweetmeats. When he heard that, the guy thanked the girl for answering all his questions and said that they would stop there for now, also smiling. He told the girl that he was glad that he could get to know her better, which scared the protagonist so much that she didn't understand why Ruggieri was so excited that he was able to get to know her better, even though he didn't really know who she really was. Then, bowing her head down, Farm asked the lad if he couldn't really recognize her from such simple questions. Also, she added that almost all noble ladies have the same tastes. Such preferences are only a small part of Erzet. Ruggieri designed the equipment to get close to her, but he ends up asking such stupid questions, the answers to which won't get to know the person any closer. Watching the artist draw the girl, Farm reminded him that she was most interested in this project since it could save a bunch of innocent people's lives. She also added that she didn't believe his words, which surprised Ruggieri a little. And looking at the girl with his cold gaze, he immediately kissed her hand and said that that was enough for today, wishing her a good day. Looking at the departing prince, the protagonist compared him to a spoiled apricot, beautiful on the outside but rotten on the inside. Suddenly, Erzetta approached the girl, who was very glad that this meeting was finally over. At that moment, Farm looked at the princess with her cold gaze and said she was very glad that the lady did not have to go out with such a man. A couple of days later, the protagonist brushed the hair of a lady who said that Marquis was seen coming to the academy, and everyone thinks that he came there to report on the work done and to explain to everyone the principle of the steam engine. The princess also added that now that they have finally learned the general plan of the mechanism, it will be possible to complete the equipment without Ruggieri, which surprised Pharma, and she began to think that it was all because of her words, namely when she said that this mechanism was the most important thing to her. The protagonist didn't even notice how she stopped brushing the lady's hair, who stood up abruptly and reminded her maids that they should leave quickly, as they might be late for dinner. In a little while, all the members of the Sola family were at dinner, where Farm was also present as a common maid. Suddenly, Erzet's youngest daughter, Visu, began to tell her parents about the delightful voice of Pharma, explaining that her father was a musician, so she had learned it from childhood. However, only the main character remembered that her father was a musician, but he only performed on the street and could still perform at banquets or at the market. Suddenly, one little fellow named Pontano, who is the young gentleman of the Sole family, became very interested in hearing that angelic voice. Then, Weiss asked the main character if she could sing about Roland's Wanderer, which made the girl a little uncomfortable, as she feels uncomfortable when singing love songs. Also, the Duke, who was holding a glass of wine, also became interested in her voice and asked the girl to sing the song which his youngest daughter had mentioned. When Farm heard this, she immediately asked the servants to sing the melody for this song, and she began to sing this song with her angelic voice, which mesmerized everyone in the room. Finally finished, everyone immediately began to praise her, saying that she had a very pure and beautiful voice. Also, the Duke. The girl is a very kind person since she was able to help the princess, so he has no doubts about the maid and can trust her with his daughter. The man also asked the girl to contact Erzeta if she had any difficulties. He also promised that he would also try and help her if she ever needed it. After hearing this, Farm felt very satisfied and realized that she had a good life ahead of her. Also, the song that was chosen was even better than she thought, and she managed to leave a good impression of herself. However, when she sang this song, she didn't understand why she was immersed in this story. The story of a noble knight who fell in love with an ordinary shepherd girl who reminds her of someone. Suddenly, she stopped thinking about it at once, because she shouldn't think about it, and she began to assure herself that the song was just a reminder of his words, but she didn't even know if he was sincere with her or not. She should also never forget that this is just part of the plan and they're just using each other. Sometime later, Pharma had another meeting with the prince who intended to paint her. Suddenly, the guy looked at the girl and asked her why she was staring at him so long, and he thought he'd done something wrong. To which the girl apologized and said she was just thinking about something. Hearing this, Ruggieri thought it might have something to do with him helping the academy, and he explained that he thought she might like it. So he did so. Also, the princess wondered if she was looking at him like that because she found him cute, which surprised the girl, and she stood up abruptly and started yelling at the guy. They say it's not really like that, and she was just curious what Ruggieri was thinking all the time. She also wanted to know why he was trying so hard and taking so long to paint this picture. Suddenly, the girl noticed that the prince seemed to be deliberately canvas, so she decided to snatch the painting from him abruptly to see what he had painted there. All the while, looking at this drawing, Farm started to laugh, for instead of seeing her noble drawing, she saw some ordinary drawing that looked like it was drawn by a 2-year-old child. While the protagonist laughed out loud, Ruggieri felt very uncomfortable as he didn't think the girl would ever see his true drawing abilities. Also, because the girl snatched the canvas from him, his face got a little dirty and he wiped his face from the paint, reminding Pharma that he had already told her that his skills were not enough to capture her beauty. However, the protagonist, smirking and looking at the guy, smirked and replied that that wasn't really the problem, and she wondered why he had decided to paint her portrait in the first place. To which the prince calmly replied that it was the only chance to stay close to the princess, and after all, she, her father, had gotten what they had wanted for so long. Suddenly moving closer to the man, Farm began to gently touch his face, asking why he had abruptly decided to tell her everything, and she figured he was just afraid of being punished. Although the prince is a painter, he is a great help to the girl in her project with the channel, and she knows that their communication will be good for her. So she has allowed Ruggieri to continue drawing, with the hope that he will be able to improve his drawing skills someday. Suddenly, the guy reminded the girl that he saw her with some musical instrument in her hands. It happened when they bumped into each other in the garden. He liked her image very much then, so he wanted to paint this portrait. He also added that he thought it would be cool to capture a girl playing an instrument. Even though he was a little rushed because of his feelings, he was still pleased that his scribbles were able to make Pharma feel better. He also apologized to the girl, saying that he had to leave first and would not be able to finish this drawing, unfortunately, at which the girl smilingly allowed the prince to leave, as she noticed that they did look rather tired indeed. Alone in the room, she thought it wasn't so bad. There is an old fairy tale that tells of the shepherd Asta, and the water fairy Rebeli. Their meeting was destined by fate. People often compared them to Farm's parents. Father played the lute traveling around the world, and Mother danced with a tambourine. Then the main character found that the three of them will live in perfect harmony and happiness, traveling around the world. However, she thought so until her mother passed away from illness. After that incident, music was no longer played in their home, and they sank to the edge of poverty. Lute now became a means of earning a living, and traveling went into distant plans. Also in their wooden house, laughter ceased. Alone without food stretched for ages. Also, the main character began to notice that her father began to appear at home less and less often, and then he stopped coming at all. Then all she had to do was wait for him, although she was very worried and afraid. But in the end, she still had to give up. Left completely alone, protagonist in every possible way trying to earn money for a living. Then she decided to forget everything and live earlier. But one day back at her house, she suddenly noticed her father had finally returned. He came back not alone, but with a newborn baby son. At that moment, Farm never doubted the sincerity of her father's feelings so much, because he loved her mother very much, and death had a special effect on him. So she thinks that in his new relationship, he was also sincere. But his feelings were no use at all, because he couldn't take care of any of his children. So the protagonist sees Ruggieri as her father, thinking that they are not different at all. He spends time with her while she pretends to be Erzetta, but when he finds out the truth, he immediately leaves her. Being in her home and looking at her favorite little brother, Pharma hopes that in time things will fall into place and she'll be okay. Meanwhile, Angelo was in the prince's mansion, not understanding why he was doing so badly, and also regretting that he had taken up the rack of things at the same time. He also realized that the protagonist wasn't as easy a target as he thought, but he didn't understand why. Besides, he imagined her a little different. She's quick-witted and always one step ahead of him, and you can't let your guard down around her. Though he had tried several times before to bring her down that much, at least briefly, he ended up having to play the clown again like last time. So it felt like they were going head-to-head. Suddenly, he stopped abruptly and wondered why he was thinking about her right now. Suddenly turning around, Angelo felt some kind of bad feeling, as if someone had come here. So he stood up abruptly and grabbed his raincoat and ran outside to see what was going on. Meanwhile, the prince was in some hotel yelling at some man saying he's in a tough spot, so he's asking for a room for the day. However, the woman who ran this hotel couldn't just give a room without paying in advance, and in general, the woman doesn't understand what this beggar is doing here, which greatly surprised Ruggieri, since it's the first time he's been called such a thing. The woman also added that the prince looks like a smarmy boy who ran away from a bankrupt theater and doesn't belong here. Then they just took and threw the prince outside, closing the door right in front of his nose, which shocked the man today. He was in complete shock because for the first time he faced such an attitude to himself. So he began to call the owners of this hotel, saying that only ugly people live here. And is it so difficult for them to show a little mercy? Suddenly the prince turned around and saw Angelo, who at once asked his lord to call him Elio, for everyone here knew him by that name. And Angelo was also very curious as to what the prince was doing in these parts in such a state. To which the guy got up and answered that he had been robbed, and it would be strange for him to stay at home since Angelo had already come here on his behalf. Besides, he was tired of living in the tower, so he decided to go traveling. But when he arrived in Valeria, all his money had been stolen from him. Pointing his finger upwards, the prince finished his story, adding that this was the way he had refused in this place, although he even had to sell his clothes in order to buy food, which shocked Angelo, who was puzzled and asked Ruggieri to at least change his clothes and wash his face. After a while, when he had finally washed his face, he wondered if his servant could really paint, to which Angelo replied that his father was an artist, though a third-rate one. But Ruggieri was more interested if there was any progress about the princess, to which the lad replied that Erzetta was one of those who easily opened to others. He also thought he realized that she probably doesn't like this marriage either, so then he has no reason to stay here at all. He also added that Erzetta is a typical lady who keeps her distance until marriage, so Angelo thinks that she will not give up so easily the marriage arranged by her family. Also, the guy was very interested in why the prince was so against this marriage, since he would have to get married sooner or later, if he wanted to inherit the title of Duke. Upon hearing these words, Ruggieri simply stared silently into his servant's eyes, saying nothing to him. Suddenly, after a few seconds' silence, he still ordered Angelo to go and to try harder to. Once outside, Angelo talked to some mysterious man in a black trench coat, who immediately asked the guy if he had sent the report, and asked if he was sure he was working. Angelo took off his glasses and explained that he was just waiting for the right moment, as she was not so easy to please, and the mysterious man was not the only one in a hurry, so he should just wait a little longer. Suddenly, this mysterious man reminded Angelo not to try anything stupid, and he shouldn't forget the deal. Then the man immediately left the place, at the same time as Angelo said that he remembered everything, so he shouldn't always be reminded of it. Wiping his glasses, he didn't understand why everyone was pushing him so hard. He also realized that he had to get close to Erzetta as soon as possible and win her heart. It was already June, by which time preparations for the summer festival called Della Luce were well underway. During it, the streets are decorated with a variety of flowers, fruits, brightly colored fabrics and lanterns, and the women in the castle make decorative flowers in their spare time. Meanwhile, Erzetta was making ornamental flowers thinking she was good at it, when in fact she was not. Meanwhile, the protagonist was also busy making decorative flowers. She also offered Erzet's help, as she had a lot of time on her hands. She also added that now she didn't have to try so hard anyway. Besides which, she was glad that she was finally able to deal with her feelings. Anyway, her relationship will be over soon, so she doesn't need to dress up, so she figured she'd wear something comfortable. After a while, Angelo, who had a small gift in his hands for our protagonist, did not come to visit the protagonist. Inside this gift was viola. Angelo started to tell me that this instrument was created in Valeria, and thanks to the bow, you can play without touching the strings with your hand. When the main character heard this, she immediately wanted to touch such an interesting instrument, which surprised her because it differed from the lute only by the number of strings. Suddenly touching him, she immediately drew away from him, as she did not want to appear to be such a valuable product. She also immediately apologized to Angelo, asking why he decided to show it to her, to which the guy replied that she shouldn't apologize at all, because this tool is now hers. He began to say that when he saw this instrument in the market, he immediately thought of Erzetta. While he was listening to the explanation, he didn't realize that he was already carrying the instrument in his hands, but he doesn't know how to play it at all, so he bought it as a gift. Then the protagonist turned away and said she had no reason to accept the gift, to which Angelo replied that if she refused, the instrument would rot in a dusty warehouse, and the heart of the one who dreamed of buying it and under the craftsman invested in its creation will forever rot in the warehouse. Also, the guy added that if the girl does not want this gift, he can give her something else. Suddenly looking at the guy, the protagonist explained to him that she understood that he was doing it on purpose to get a gift from her in return, but she had nothing at all. But Angelo said that the princess had probably misunderstood everything, and he was the one most interested in seeing her private library, which surprised Pharma a little. She understood that it was certainly not a problem. However, she should ask permission from Erzeth-sama first. While the princess was talking about something, the prince immediately interrupted her, saying that while she was thinking about this gift, she could keep the instrument for herself, which surprised the protagonist a little bit, and she didn't understand why he said that without even asking her opinion. Suddenly, Angelo suggested to Pharma to go back to her portrait, and it is he who proposes to draw outside today. After a while going out into the street, the heroes, as usual, talked among themselves, where the prince explained to the girl that natural light best conveys the true colors of the world.